allow myself to introduce myself. My name is Adrian Maldonado. Hello again. I'm speaking today on a site that is very near and dear to my heart at the moment, but I spent a lot of my student days railing against studying sites like these. Iona is one of the major, sort of central establishment, if you'd like, elite monasteries of its day. It's at the top level. And it's also, because of that, had quite a lot of research already thrown at it for well over 100 years. So during my PhD research on sort of early Christianity in Scotland, I thought, well, Iona's seen a lot of this research, can we sort of go somewhere else? And since then, since Historic Scotland and now Historic Environment Scotland have redesigned the site in the last few years, redisplayed rather the site, I've come to realize, as have many others, who were involved in that redisplay program, we realized that despite all the research that had gone on this site, that we didn't know a good amount. In fact, there was a lot that we were surprised by how much we didn't know about Iona. And it goes back to one of the points raised by Becky in her paper. Just because we seem to know a lot about the Romans, or the early Christians in this case, it doesn't mean that we've figured it all out just yet. And Iona is a really good example of that. It really begins with this Historic Scotland-led redisplay effort in 2012 and 2013. That was the origins of what we used to call the Glasgow Iona Research Group. It's since just become the Iona Research Group because we wanted to expand into a network of scholars working on early Christianity more widely. And in the last year, we've been lucky enough to go back and do some new fieldwork on Iona, a very rare occurrence that we're very lucky to have got permission to do. But the reason that we're doing it is not just to sort of chase treasure or sort of find more stuff in a site that already has quite a lot more stuff. It's a problem of management and interpretation. Again, there's lots of gaps in knowledge despite all the work that's gone on there. And the trenches that we were able to dig last year in 2017 were actually re-excavating old trenches rather than really opening up new ground to a certain extent. I just wanted to sort of show you where Iona is now, peripheral perhaps, but back in the early medieval period, it would have been at the center of a sea route that traced through the North Channel into the Irish Sea and to the Atlantic and Mediterranean beyond. It's only a small place, and only a really small corner of that island is actually occupied by the early Christian site. And the vast majority of the work on Iona has gone on within 500 meters, essentially, of where the church sits now. So you've got the whole rest of the island, really, which is virtually unexplored compared to the abbey itself. Rises to power and rises to fame through the work and legacy of a single man, okay? That's how the story goes. That's how history was written for a very long time. One great man, St. Columba in this case, a historical figure, more than you can say for most of the early Christian saints for whom we have very little other corroborating evidence. We know he landed there in 563, established a monastery, dies there in 597, presumably buried there as well. And we have histories and lots of sort of the history of Scotland. The narrative of Scotland as a nation has been bound up in this narrative of the Christian missionaries coming from abroad and establishing Christianity here, leading to Christian kingship, and then eventually the nation of Scotland. But you come back to the core and you come back to what the archaeology has actually found, and the vision of this has actually been quite negative. An article by Jerry O'Sullivan in the 90s puts together this map of all the separate interventions. These little colored polygons are all the trenches that have been dug on Iona over the last 150 years. It's what Martin Carver and others have called death by 1,000 cuts. This is no way to explore any archaeological site. And it's because there hasn't been a single research agenda. There hasn't been one research question that people are after, other than, can we find evidence for Columba? You know, and in the 80s and 90s, questions got a little bit more varied than that, but effectively, there hasn't been a really good program of sustained archaeological research here leading to this. And this has raised a management issue for the people who manage the property in care at the moment. don't really know, because a lot of this hasn't been published, what was actually found in each of these trenches. And that's kind of shocking to sort of find out. What we were tasked to do was explore these yellow trenches. This is the Charles Thomas excavations in the 50s and 60s, which were never published for various reasons. Charles Thomas becomes the early Christian leader of a generation, essentially, of archaeologists of early Christianity. But at the time that he was digging on Iona, was only establishing himself. Didn't have a full-time job until the second year of these excavations, just fresh from his master's degree. He eventually becomes a sort of the guy, but at this point he was just kind of starting out. And because of that, perhaps, never really got around to getting to grips with what he had found on Iona. Also, it was terribly complicated. I actually got to meet the man just once before he passed away last year. This is in 2012, when Catherine Forsyth of this university phoned him up and asked him, does he still have the archive of his excavations from Iona? And he said, yes, and if you don't mind, he'd like for somebody to take it off of his hands. You know, it was quite clear that he wasn't going to get around to it at that point. So we were lucky enough to go down, myself and Peter Yeoman, then of Historic Scotland. We showed him some of the new plans, the new interpretation, which he approved of, had his blessing, which was great. And he gave me an autographed copy of his book, Early Christianity in Northern Britain. So that's me, as a child, completely starstruck. With all of his archive in the boot of our rental car. Highlight of my career so far. The stuff that was in that archive was, it was almost miraculous what had been preserved. This was the early 1950s, and radiocarbon dating wasn't yet widely available, still only quite experimental technology, but they had kept some charcoal samples from a few key sites in order to identify the species of wood. And this was kept in things like matchboxes and little boxes like these. And because Charles Thomas, being a conscientious archaeologist that he was able to pack it and store it in a way that it didn't get moldy and didn't crumble to dust in the intervening 60 years. It's still in good state, very viable, and we were able to get radiocarbon dates. We made the news. It was fantastic because it did provide some of the clearest stratified evidence, and now AMS dated evidence for something within the lifespan of St. Columba, the man himself. All right, but as I said, you know, the questions that we have on Iona weren't, did Columba exist and did he come here? We've fairly established that, but this is really good sort of in terms of outreach and engagement. This is the kind of stuff that gets people involved. Sometimes you need the headline site and the famous site to get people interested, and then draw them in, and then maybe come around to educating people about other questions that are still left to be answered. All right? A couple of things worth bringing out from this these archives, stuff that was never published before. I just want to focus on one thing that I think is really fascinating and quite important. It's these two bits of metalwork. There's this lion-shaped copper alloy mount on the left from the 8th or 9th century, and a much later copper alloy chunk from the 12th century. Both of them appear to be from a reliquary or shrine, or maybe a book cover at a push. But it looks like this is sort of high quality early Christian sacred metalwork that is potentially being produced here. And what's interesting about these two fragments is that they have violently been hacked off of whatever they used to be on. All right, and especially with the 12th century one, you can see that it's actually been pulled rather crudely off of whatever it used to be attached to. And we have good examples of shrines from Ireland which look like what this was meant to be. It looks like these are fragments of shrines or reliquaries, possibly of Columba himself, that were kept in the shrine. And this is a sort of reimagining of what that might be. Now, looking at other museum collections across the continent, it's quite clear that there are other chunks of stuff that seems to have come from what's called the Arca, leading me to make this brilliant, thank you, pun. This is stuff that was found in Scandinavian countries, essentially, and ended up in museums across the continent. This is quite clear evidence of stuff that's been hacked and stolen off of a shrine somewhere, and the art style suggests this was Iona material specifically, and been brought to Scandinavia by those Viking raiders. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. We have lots of good archaeological evidence now of Viking raids in Scotland, in particular from Portmahomack, where we actually have the massive burning event, and we have skulls with blade wounds in the cranium, which are dated to the Viking Age. So again, it's not about proving that there were Vikings, but it's about what happens after, and this is where Iona has something to say that hasn't really been said before. The story about Iona is all about those Viking raids once you get to the 9th century. It's all about these very early Viking raids, some of the first, in fact, the first in Scotland, happened here, and then repeatedly through the 9th and into the 10th century, as late as that. There were more Viking raids. So the story that grows up around this is that Vikings essentially end the monastery on Iona and other monasteries across Scotland. And we know from monasteries like Whithorn and Portmahomack that they continue on as sites. Maybe they transform a bit in the Viking Age, but they continue to be Christian sites. So why would Iona be any exception? Now, thankfully, out of the results of our recent fieldwork, we've actually been able to add to the existing record of radiocarbon dates, and it's really pleasing to see that we've got this pretty much continuous range of radiocarbon dates from several different contexts around the abbey and within the vallum, the enclosing ditch, which take us straight the way from Columba's day through the Viking Age without anything that looks like a real hiatus. This is some of the context that this is coming from. Around it, we have Viking Age sculpture. We have 9th century Christian sculpture, sort of elite masterpieces of insular art style high crosses, and even a runic inscribed cross itself from the 10th or 11th century. It's quite clear that not only do Vikings not stop the monastery here from being a going concern, once the Scandinavian settlers begin to convert to Christianity, this is one of the sites that they're choosing to patronize. The kings of the Dublin and Man, the kings of Dublin and the Isle of Man come here in some cases to be buried during that 9th to 12th century phase that is characterized as Viking raids. So let me just show you a little bit about what we came across in our excavations. This was one of the trenches that we went back to. Charles Thomas's archive pointed to a couple of trenches which were actually not very well recorded because some of the drawings and photographs don't survive. We have this one photograph of this trench, which is just here to the south of the abbey nave today, with this massive wall, dry stone structure, seems to be curving in towards the church, but it's on a different alignment than anything else. It doesn't belong there. And Charles Thomas and his team were only able to expose it for a few days, record it, and cover it back up. It looks like they intended to go back, but they never managed it. And this is how we know. This is one of the only drawings which survives. And you can see how some of those layers don't quite meet up to the wall because it was kind of indeterminate. And so we had no idea what kind of phase this wall belonged to. It's too big and too important and in too much of a central location to leave the question unanswered. So we sought for and received permission from Hess and the Scottish government to go back and re-excavate a couple of trenches. Now this makes it really personal. We had some evidence of the archaeologists themselves. I see Josh sitting in the audience. He was one of the archaeologists who came down on this deposit, which will outlive us all. This is Charles Thomas and their team's cache of empty wine and beer bottles and whiskey bottles, you know. More than anything early Christian, I think this is the main discovery of that year. It's stuff that they left behind, which sort of reminds us, archaeologists then, same as archaeologists now. But interestingly, Iona was a dry island, wasn't it, in the 1950s, and so this had to be done in the dark. So we re-exposed that, and that's great. And underneath that deposit, really nice, secure waterlogged deposits from that ditch. Other nice things like a penny left at the bottom of one of their trenches, and this beautiful reused tent peg used as a section nail, still in situ, with our modern tape marking it so we didn't rip it out. Really fantastic sort of re-excavation of this seminal site. If you think about the Christian history, all right? And Kathy McKeever was able to identify very specifically some of these bottles. So it is possible to do archival research on this level, which is just a nice thing for someone to pursue in future. We've kept those bottles. This is the reason we know that they intended to come back to this. There was a couple of stones sticking out of the turf that I noticed when we went back to resurvey some of these trenches in advance of the excavation. We wanted to find out exactly where they were, and as you're relocating them using your map, there were some stones sticking out of the turf, which are not on any map. They weren't meant to be there, but they were exactly over, as far as we could reconstruct, where Charles Thomas had dug one of his trenches. There was a couple of trenches that were marked this way on the surface. So when we went back, we knew exactly where to go, and it turns out that that bit of walling wasn't the wall itself. The wall itself was 2 feet under the turf. This is something that was rebuilt after, and when we kept uncovering it, it looked like they had really sort of put together something on the quick and sort of slapped some cement over it to keep it in place. It looks as if to sort of mark it on the surface. And here's Joss now of Hess standing by the wall with the sort of leveled up dry stone walling that they used to sort of mark it on the surface. When we extended that trench, again, with generous permission from the Scottish government to do so, we extended the trench, and it turns out the wall continues, and it begins to curve in a very tantalizing way. Now, we only exposed this much of that structure, but from that, I mean, take 3 guesses of what that looks like. It could be the corner of a massive enclosure like a cashel, but it actually begins to thin out. And it doesn't look as sturdy as it does there in the original trench to your left. It looks more like a sort of an inner and outer faced wall, potentially of a building, all right? And a wall with a sort of east-facing curved wall like this is very possibly a church. I can't say it for sure, but it's not supposed to be there. It's something that we didn't know about. So we'll have to see what else we can do to sort of define this structure a bit further without damaging any more of the site. But stay tuned for news on that front. All right, what's interesting about that and what's hopeful is that even in just this very minimal intervention onto the site, we've actually been able to get some really good and evocative, really tantalizing radiocarbon dates off of this. You can barely see it in the back, but there is a sort of charcoaly layer, a slaggy layer that butts up against that wall. It quite clearly post-dates the construction of that wall, and the radiocarbon date from that, 7th or 8th century, is much earlier than we thought for this structure. So there's something going on here that we have to sort of see what we can do scientifically to sort out. We're getting soil micromorphology done by colleagues of ours in Aberdeen, which are going to tell us how this sort of nice stratigraphy has built up. All right, and above that, I'm happy to share, and this stuff is available on our website, the reports of where this is all coming from, that the demolition layers and the layers immediately over that deposit within the structure of the church, which we didn't excavate, only the structures that sort of, the deposits that overlay the abandonment of this building date back much earlier than we thought as well. These dates from material that is coming from the inside of that structure post-demolition are 11th and 12th centuries. Now, the Benedictine Abbey on Iona is built in the beginning of the 13th century. So what we've got here for the first time is really well dated and stratified evidence for what is actually a dark age in the history of Iona. What happens in between those famous Viking raids and the arrival of the Benedictines at the beginning of the 13th century. And you would think for a site as famous as Iona that we would know everything that's going on, but for some reason we only have very few analytic references to what's going on Iona in this phase. We actually don't know very much about it. So this is the beginning, perhaps, of sort of beginning to piece together what's going on here. Now, what's going on here really depends on what this structure is and what it's used for. And so we'll stay tuned, I suppose, to see what happens next. But that's just to say that in this site, like so many others that are seemingly so well known, there's so much more that can yet be done. And just by reopening some old boxes, Even opening stuff up in the museum that has been published and redating material. Any radiocarbon date that's more than 10 or maybe 20 years old rather, it can be refined with the technology that we have now. With animal and human bone, we have isotope analyses that weren't available. With animal bone and human bone, you can get genetic information out of it, and you can trace the movement of cattle and the sourcing of food and things that sort of tell you a little bit more about the sort of ancestry-based narratives that we get so many headlines about. There's more and more interesting questions that can be asked of archival material now more than ever before. This is just a pitch, not just for more work on Iona, but more work on re-excavating museum archives. Here in Scotland, we are fantastically fortunate to have more than 200 years of museum collections kept for by charitable societies, by the state, and by our national heritage institutions. The King's Museum in Aberdeen, the collection there goes back to 1727. And the National Museum of Antiquities, the predecessor of the NMS, contains the Society of Antiques collection, which takes us back to 1780. Again, even sites that are well known or are thought to be well known are well worth a revisit. This is something that you, as students, I hope, will take on. You don't always have to have a career in digging trenches. You can speak to your local museum curator and see what kinds of ways you can work together. This is just one of many ways to be an archaeologist. All right, and there's a lot of potential now that after the sort of papers that we had mentioning the archaeology strategy. When you're dealing with local museums and regional collections, there's so much potential for engagement, for outreach, for really sort of local stories to have national significance. There's so much potential for education and other value other than just getting more radiocarbon dates and finding more stuff. I think the potential here is great. So I'll just leave you with that, all right, folks? Thank you very much.